But in some ways, it is also about upsetting the table, bringing in reflections and perspectives that can upset and overturn systems of discrimination, hierarchy, and exclusion. And that is something that we will be doing today by our focus on agency of the child. Before I invite Professor Rohan Gideon to come and deliver his talk, I want to invite my colleague, Venetia Asare, to come and give us a few practical details.
Hello, everyone. It's nice to see you all. So with regard to the format of the webinar, we'll start off with a presentation and have a questions and answers session for about 15 to 20 minutes. We also have some translation in Portuguese as well. So if you speak Portuguese and would like to hear this webinar in Portuguese, you would have to click on more below on your screen and select Portuguese. So I will send more information in the chat. Thank you.
Thank you, Venetia, for that. Friends, it's a delight that we have today with us Professor Rohan Gideon, who is Professor of Christian Theology at the United Theological College, Bengaluru, India, and is also a priest of the Church of South India. Professor Rohan finished his doctorate from the University of Manchester, and his thesis was on children, rights, and theological methods. He is somebody whose involvement in this specific area of children, rights, and Christian theology is sustained through publications, research supervision, and advising his church on child protection policies, and also designing courses and curricula for bachelor's and master's levels. Apart from that, Professor Gideon has led workshops combining it with Christian education or fields that involve or talk about children. And he has been involved in advising many Christian organizations on child-friendly and child-centered ministries and theologies. So without much further ado, may I invite Professor Rohan Gideon to talk to us about the agency of the child. Over to you.
Dear friends, it's such a joy for me to be here with you, especially to share my thoughts and views on this robust theological movement that we have been part of and been reading and researching about in the last 25 years. And thank you all for having me here today to share my thoughts on this theme, agency of the child and child-focused theologies. My special thanks to USPG, especially its General Secretary, the Revd Dr Duncan Dormer, and the staff of USPG office here. Right now I'm in USPG office. I'm doing my presentation from the USPG office. So I thank the entire staff and the General Secretary for this opportunity. And very special thanks to Canon Dr. Peniel Rajkumar, a dear friend and global theologian and director of missions at USPG, not only for this opportunity, but also for the generous support during my sabbatical research here right now in the UK. For my presentation, I have three broad sections. The first section will be on definitions and potentials of the term agency of the child. And the second part is, which are some of the child-focused theologies? What are their methods? And what are their explanations of the agency of the child? and how far they have theologically explained the idea of the agency. And the third part is how we can further widen the understanding of the agency of the child, both at the level of methods and also at the level of theology. I know I'm covering a very vast area, but I hope to finish within the given time. Generally, in academic contexts, the themes about children are covered in practical theology. If you are a theologian, you would know the issues about children come under practical theology and many of the traditional theological disciplines. In the church and in our worship structures, children are restricted, or the discussion on children are restricted to Christian education or Sunday school, which gets lesser attention and budget. Children become mere recipients of adult generosity or entitlement. Now, there have even been movements for child-centered and child-friendly churches, challenging adult-centric church and worldviews. Even liberation theologies have taken time, more time than we had expected, to take up issues on children. And therefore, it is in this context we try and understand the significance of the agency of children, or the agency of the child in our midst. I present my thoughts within a core outline, which I call a purposeful triad. At least three principles need to work together if we wish to see the agency of the child flourish in a very strong adult-centered or adult-dominant theological and missional context. The three principles are the agency of the child, that's the first one. The second one is what I call the rooted solidarity of adults with children. And the third one is the immanent mystery of God and the child. So the three principles: the agency of the child, the rooted solidarity of adults with children, and the immanent mystery of God and the child. So today's presentation will focus only on the issue of the agency of the child, but the other two principles will be hinted to wherever needed. So the place of children, from being the objects of our mission to being central and agentic, has altered the ways we have engaged in our mission. I'll briefly share some of the definitions and scope of the agency of the child. By definition, children are those human beings who come under the age of 18, and the agency of the child can be explained at two levels. The first level is children's capacity to express their views, opinions, and creativity that affirms the wisdom endowed in them as human beings. And the second level is children's capacity to interrogate the difficult socio-cultural and political circumstances that affect their being and becoming. I'm very sorry, I have PowerPoint and I forgot to share with you. Just give me a moment. So I was at this stage of my presentation to explain what is the agency of the child. It is children's own responses and reactions to the desecration of their rights and dignity, and children's capacity to interrogate the difficult socio-cultural and political circumstances that affect their being and becoming. Both these understandings have the potential for newness of understanding of our existential issues. So the agency of the child is not just about what children speak or what children say or what we hear them do. Children in war-hit and poverty-stricken nations and continents inform us that children's feeling of hope in times of hopelessness and their sense of resilience, even after the loss of parents and elders in the community, show their deeply endowed capacity to fight things through and live longer. Even these capacities are being included into the definition of the agency of the child in the recent researches. Around last year, I was in Sarajevo in Bosnia-Herzegovina, where there is a very powerful museum called War Childhood Museum. The museum has a unique way of treasuring traumatic yet significant memories of children. What children could not express then in the wider media or in their local communities during war were either written down in letters or depicted through paintings and also expressed through the toys, sports equipments, music instruments, the clothes they wore, their bikes, and so on, that children had safeguarded very dearly as their own expressions and feelings. So the museum now voices the views of children in ways children wanted the world to hear them then, but because people were not able to hear them then, now the museum continues to voice children's views. So this is also one way in which the agency of the child is being expanded in its understanding. Now through the media, we hear the voices of children caught in Israel-Palestine war, destructions, and genocide, especially of their shattered dreams and of the present and of their future. Having this as a broad spectrum of principles to define and explain the agency of the child, I wish to present at least 3 prominent streams of theologies that have focused on children and their agency. The child-focused theologies are what is commonly known as child theology. And the second one is holistic child development. And third one is theologies of childhood. Child theology has become a very common word of praise to talk about anything that speaks of children and theology. However, this stream, child theology, has its own scope and has its own limitations. And that's the reason why I'm bringing out these 3 streams. The first stream is child theology, second is holistic child development, and the third is theologies of childhood. Child theology speaks of ways in which the experience of childhood critiques theology. So this is where children's own views and expressions critique theology. It carries the tone of liberationist theologies where experience of children is the key. The views of children are treated as potential enough to restate our traditional theologies and even doctrines. Just as Canon Peniel introduced the focus and vision of the feast, it is to turn the tables around. So this is where children's views and expressions can even turn around our traditional doctrines. And one of the central hermeneutical principle is the centrality of the child. And when the child is in the center of the adult community, the child gets its prominence and people recognize the views and expressions of children. Marche Bunge, one of the pioneers of child theology, has this definition for child theology. It re-examines not only conceptions of children and obligations to them, but also fundamental doctrines and practices of the church, drawing on analogies to feminist, Black, and liberation theologies. Child theologies have as their task not only to strengthen the commitment to and understanding of a group that has often been voiceless, marginalized, and oppressed, which is children, but also to reinterpret Christian theology and practice as a whole. Just as the poor transform theology in liberation theology, and just as women transform it in feminist theologies, so in child theology, it is the impact of the child that transforms theology. So by now, we have already picked up key words for agency, that is presence, impact, views, expressions, dreams, and desires. And child theology is akin to new theologies that have brought new questions to the Bible based on the experiences of those who had long been marginal to formal reflection. The poor, the women, the marginalized races that have brought to us liberation, feminine and Black theologies. Children are the most oppressed social group. And child theology also highlights the fact that children in traditional theologies are depicted as objects and adults as subjects. So adults set the direction to socialize children into their respective cultures, religions, and worldview, or in our own language, into our churches and Christian education. While the adults are sympathetic to children's needs, we are not negating that adults are not sympathetic. The centrality and the agency of the child gets overshadowed by the obligation of the adults to children. That is where the adults are not able to draw clear lines between their own obligation and the space that children will need to express their views and understandings. And this is where adulthood has become predominant than childhood, to an extent that children haven't had their due space. So these are some of the perspectives and views that child theology as a stream has offered us about the centrality of the child and children's agency. And then there was a parallel movement to child theology called holistic child development, which developed in Asia and Africa. And holistic child development is a new global movement afoot with the vision to reach and mobilize the next generation, to maximize children's transformational impact while they are young, and mobilize them for continuing impact for the rest of their lives. And therefore, holistic child development recognizes the impact children can make in their immediate context and also in the bigger world. And this definition was given by Dan Brewster, a pioneer of holistic child development. So holistic child development has three broad themes. First one is holism, which addresses the physical needs of children and young people, as well as their spiritual needs, and defining the child. The child tells us we are not just learning about children, but also about ourselves, which propels to seek the society to help children in a way that the society advances the agency of the child. The third idea is development. And the idea of development is drawn biblically based on Jesus' own development that desires to see children grow in wisdom, stature, in favor with God, and favor with human beings. This dictum neatly encompasses all aspects of the entire person or the whole person and provides a useful model to create meaningful, holistic child development programs. So in this movement, the agency of the child includes the opportunities children get to develop themselves holistically, which will enhance and which will advance their understanding, their expressions, and then their views in the society and church. So child theologies have a more effective and progressive presentation of the agency of children than discussed in the theologies of childhood or holistic child development. Then there is, before that, I also need to say that there is another stream called Theologies of Childhood. The Theologies of Childhood assesses how children have been depicted in our traditional theologies, most often children as subjects. At the same time, then there are brilliant theologians like Karl Rahner, especially who tries to see the divine in the child. And he talks about the infinite divineness that children have, just like all of us claim to be created in the image of God. And therefore, the agency of children could be significantly brought to the center of theological discussion by formulating the principles based on these three streams, especially when they are combined with liberation theologies. The reason for combining this with liberation theologies is the primary principle of liberation theology is about the voice of the voiceless. It's easy to talk about the voice of women, voice of Dalits, voice of tribals, voice of marginalized communities. But the crucial methodological, cultural, religious, and social challenges come when we have to talk about the voice of children. And this is where we see a big gap in Christian theologies as far as we see the voice of the marginalized communities on one hand, which are all adults, as compared to the voice of children. And this is where children-focused theologies come up with the principle called the lens of the child, the lens of the child. And Marcia Bungay says, by using the lens of the child or by foregrounding the child theologies will be able to offer new insights into central themes of Christian faith and practice, such as God, creation, Christology, theological anthropology, sin, salvation, faith, the word, worship, prayer, sacraments, missiology, and eschatology. Basically, the presence of children and their views can change or turn tables around to give us completely new and radical interpretations of all these doctrines. Because the child is like a lens through which some aspects of God and God's revelation can be seen more clearly. And the child is like a light that throws existing theology into new relief. These are the words of Keith White and Wilmer, two of the prominent theologians in the stream of child theology. And these three child-focused theologies have come up with a common method, and the method is called the child in the midst method. The child in the midst method. I wish to offer to you at least three interpretations that this method gets in child-focused theologies. But first and foremost, the idea of the child in the midst comes from the biblical narrative where Jesus places the child in the midst of the disciples to show the disciples the way to the kingdom of God. It comes in Matthew 18, Mark 9, Luke 9, which go on to say that effectively children are agents. Children are our lenses. Children have their views. Children can impact people. And children are also active participants. And John Collier says, before that, I wish to take you through three interpretations of the child in the midst method. And the first interpretation of the child in the midst method is children are symbolic and a silent presence. What I'm doing at the moment is giving us a review of what has happened so far in this method called the child in the midst method. One of the ways the child in the midst method is presented is the child in the midst is just a symbolic or a silent presence. John Collier says it should not affect us whether or not children are actually present. It should not affect us whether or not children are actually present. The child that is placed in the midst of the disciples is a silent child. yet it stands in splendid isolation. And the child should influence the way we do theology. It might be to plant a mustard seed in one child or allow a child to plant one seed in me. And they go on to say it is necessary to emphasize that the child should not be the primary focus of or the criterion of child theology, because the child is not God. There is a danger of inadvertent or practical idolization of the children, so that in child-friendly religious discourse, the child in effect takes the place of God. Then, rather than the child being upheld and justified by the truth of God, the child would subvert and block the truth of God, and our thinking for children would be deprived of help of God. What is happening in this debate is how far, White and Wilmer are trying to argue how far we can take the idea of the agency of God and where we should draw lines. Somewhere, White and Wilmer have a fear that if we start talking about children, or if we start making children central, we are displacing God, or there is a danger of idolization. There is this theological fear. We can always question whether that fear is fair. Have we not had methods in liberation theology where when we bring Dalits to the center of theological discourse, or women to the center of theological discourse, or different marginalized groups to the center of discourse, have they displaced God? Have they displaced Christ? The answer is no. So we can always raise a question to this thought. So by bringing children to the center, do children displace God? Do children become idols? Do children displace Christ? So these are the critical questions that we can always raise to this thought. And they go on to say this, however precious any part of creation is, and children are very dear to God's heart, anything that displaces God will tend to become an idol. We see that there is an ongoing struggle, a struggle that we all of us go through to see how far we can bring children. I think I need to probably give my own interpretation to it. White and Wilmer are probably talking about children displacing God. Probably deep down when they say God, probably they also have, do children displace adults from their entitlements? Do adults fear that by bringing children to the midst, they will have to sacrifice some of their own places that they had held together so dearly as their entitled place or as their privileged place? So that is the first interpretation. That's the first interpretation that we get of the child in the midst method. And the second interpretation that we get in the child in the midst method is children from context with varied experiences. In this method, the contextual experiences of children are taken very seriously. And this child in the midst method considers as significant the actual children, not just symbolic like the previous one, not just the silent presence as the previous one. This method takes actual children whose rights have been violated or whose place and identity have been treated as insignificant. Jan Grobela, who is one of the pioneers of child theology movement, he says, biblically, the child had no status in the surrounding Mediterranean world. The child in the midst denoted marginalization and powerlessness. If the child is not without a context, so Grobela fears that child theology would only become theology from above and not anymore theology from beneath, his words. He also adds that children have their own spiritual experiences and they are equipped with the Holy Spirit to bear fruit and to practice the gifts they receive from the Spirit. Although not regularly or universally applied, the agency of the child is not a new idea for the African mind. And likewise, you all coming from different cultures. Very culturally, in our cultural narratives and legends, we have always had children having the agency as endowed to them by God or endowed to them by the power of the word. And Grobella goes on to say, adults could imagine children in their context and reformulate theological ideas that accept children in the midst. He emphasizes on the context of the children and places the onus on the adults to interpret contextual lives of children. The third interpretation of the child in the midst method, the word becomes a child. This brilliant interpretation, this beautiful interpretation is given by an Indian scholar by name Jesudasan Jairaj, where he does a sociological reading of the theology of incarnation, what he calls theology from below. Jesus, the incarnated child, was at risk at the time of his birth and sought by the political authorities. The incarnation of Jesus in the midst of people reminds us of the weak, dependent, and powerless nature of children and becomes the hope of salvation. So according to Jairaj, a child is both vulnerable and weak, and at the same time, the hope of salvation. For Jairaj, Logos Christology is about the power. It's not just about power, but also frailty and vulnerability. He emphasizes two levels of Jesus' earthly life. Firstly, Jesus the child was placed in the midst of socio-political risks in his childhood. And second, Jesus as an adult, whose childhood and the understanding of children around him molded his life and teachings. If Jesus was to pick up a child and place the child in the midst of the disciples and show the disciples the way to the kingdom of God, which means for Jesus, child was central and child was agentic. And therefore, incarnation from below gives hope to child theology because Jesus went through a stigmatized life as an illegal child. Yet, Jesus' thoughts and words brought salvation. Such a Jesus would be able to identify himself with children. These are the powerful words of Jairaj. With these three interpretations of the child in the midst method, I'll go to my third section. Sorry, I know I'm rushing through this. My third section is how can we further widen and deepen our understanding of the agency of the child? The first thought comes from my own research and from my own thought process, where I think that when we think of mission, my argument is that our work and mission with children, consciously or unconsciously, are rooted in the method of the Great Commission. And the Great Commission comes with this method of telling, leading, converting children to adults' ways of thinking, and making the children only the recipients of the gospel, but not as partners in mission. I wish to share something that I came across as an explanation to what I have just said. Some time ago, I was reviewing the literature of Edinburgh 2010 Missions Conference. Unfortunately, not much was discussed about envisioning our mission with children. Wherever there was the mention of the child, which also included words like child theology without actually meaning it, there was hardly any emphasis on the agentic presence and contribution of children. And the language was still that strong, patronizing voice that came out of the conference. And therefore, my argument is that we are still stuck in this method of telling children, not working alongside, but we say we work for children. We are working for their emancipation. But my second thought, which is called the rooted solidarity of adults, will tell us that it's not just we work for the emancipation of children, even adults need emancipation. And I call that second thought as rooted solidarity of adults with children. So, as adults, we critique our own adult entitlements, and that will bring about our emancipation. And why I call this rooted solidarity is adults embody childhood. We all embody childhood. We all have gone through the risks of being children. We all have gone through the times of vulnerabilities and victimization. Now, as adults, it's important that we go back to the roots and see how the memories of such victimization have conditioned our mindset to address the situations of victimization of children around us now. And when we are in the position of power to make decisions, we call ourselves advocates of children. We call ourselves as in solidarity with children. Now, when we are in the position of power to make decisions or in the position to influence decisions, what do we become? Do we become perpetrators of violence or exhibit a sense of empathy to victims? What mindset takes over when we are in the position of power? Will it be a selective amnesia that we were once victims and now it's my time to enjoy power and privilege and that I was deprived of in my childhood? Or will it be a sense of deeply rooted solidarity that will not let recreate risk or vulnerability because we did not like those risks and vulnerabilities ourselves when we were children? It's just that we were not able to express, or when we had expressed, our adults did not listen to us. So what kind of context that we recreate? The one of accepting views from children or recreating the same power hierarchy? And the last thought with which I will conclude is we can make the understanding of agency more deeper and wider by reclaiming affirmative depictions of children and childhood in scriptures and in a theological tradition. Bible has many powerful affirmative ideas of children. Children are created in the image of God. Children are the signs of God's covenant. I don't know how many of us teach children this, that they are signs of God's covenant. Children as messiahs or even potential messiahs. And children are the signs to the kingdom of God. So with these three thoughts, and of course there are more thoughts, I believe that we can go deeper and widen our understanding of the agency of the child. Thank you very much. Thanks for your patient listening.
Thank you, Professor Rohan, for that thought-provoking presentation. You have helped us to understand how mission and theology need to be reimagined from the perspectives of children. In some ways, you have given us glimpses of what people have identified through the concept of mission from the margins, where mission is no longer thought of as being mission which is directed to others, which renders certain sections of society to be objects of our attention, but rather mission in the reverse, where mission theologies are influenced by the perspectives of those who are often relegated to the margins. So thank you for that provocative lecture.